Samuel Roga pressed a blade beneath a waitress's chin, confident her fear would silence her like it had silenced everyone else in that grimy bar. He didn't know that Elisa Bellini had warned him once already, mentioning her brother's name in a voice too calm for someone who should be terrified. And he certainly didn't realize that Andrea Bellini, the man whose name made entire crime families vanish without witnesses, was standing 10 feet behind him in the shadows, watching with the patience of someone who'd already decided how this would end. When the voice came, low and final, "Take your hand off my sister," Samuel understood too late that the predator had been in the room all along. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The late-night shift at the nameless bar on 7th Street had settled into its usual haze of cigarette smoke and bad decisions when the atmosphere began to coil, tighten, transform into something venomous. One of those shifts in energy that everyone could sense prickling against their skin but couldn't identify until it detonated right in front of them. The neon signs flickered red and blue across scarred wooden tables, casting shadows that moved like living things across faces that had learned not to ask questions. Music thumped from corner speakers, bass-heavy and forgettable, the kind of sound designed to drown out conversations people didn't want remembered. Elisa Bellini moved through this landscape with deliberate grace, balancing trays and deflecting advances with the same measured efficiency. Her dark hair pulled back revealed a face that some mistook for soft, others for tired. But no one, not a single patron in that bar, recognized for what it truly was: disciplined. She wore a simple work uniform, pale blue with a white collar, the kind servers bought in bulk because they knew the job would destroy them eventually. But the way she carried herself suggested someone who understood that appearances were tactical choices, not accidents of circumstance. Samuel Roga had been watching her all night from his corner booth, the one everyone knew belonged to him not because he'd paid for it, but because he'd beaten 2 men unconscious for sitting there 6 months ago. He was a man built from violence and vanity, tattoos crawling up his neck and across the knuckles that gripped his whiskey glass too tightly. His buzzed head caught the light in ways that made him look perpetually angry, which wasn't far from the truth. He liked control, liked when people flinched, liked the way conversations died when he stood up. What Samuel Roga hated, what genuinely enraged him, was when people refused to be afraid. Elisa had passed his table 4 times that evening. Each time, he'd said something crude, testing her boundaries, waiting for the crack in her composure that would give him permission to escalate. Each time, she'd responded with professional distance, not rude enough to justify violence, not warm enough to encourage more attention. This restraint infuriated him. By the 5th pass, Samuel reached out and grabbed her wrist. The bar didn't go silent immediately. Conversations continued for another 3 seconds, maybe 4, the way sound takes time to process danger. But then people began to notice. The grip, the expression on Samuel's face, the way Elisa had gone completely still. "You think you're better than me?" Samuel's voice carried that particular edge of a man who'd been drinking just enough to make terrible decisions feel justified. "Walking around here like you don't hear people talking to you?" Elisa met his eyes directly, her voice level. "Let go of my arm." This was the moment Samuel expected her to break, to stammer, to look away, to give him the fear that confirmed his place in this ecosystem. Instead, she simply stood there, waiting. Samuel stood slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the bar understood this was now a performance. He still held her wrist, tighter now, pulling her closer. The switchblade appeared in his other hand with practiced ease, the kind of flourish that announced years of intimidation refined into ritual. He pressed the blade against her throat, just below her jaw, angling it upward in a way that forced her head back. The metal caught the neon light, throwing red reflections across her neck. "I asked you a question," Samuel said, loud enough now for the entire bar to hear. "You think you're better than me?" The room had gone completely silent. Pool balls sat motionless on felt. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the bartender had frozen mid-pour, liquor spilling unnoticed onto the counter. Elisa's voice remained impossibly calm. "I'm asking you to step back," Samuel laughed, a sound without humor. "Or what? You gonna call someone? You gonna—" "My brother," Elisa said quietly. "You should step back." This made Samuel laugh harder. He looked around the bar, performing for his audience, making sure they all understood how absurd this threat was. "Your brother? You hear this? She's got a brother." He tightened his grip, pressing the blade higher beneath her chin, forcing her onto her toes. His tattooed hand looked massive against her throat, the contrast making his dominance unmistakable. Elisa didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't give him anything except continued stillness and those impossibly steady eyes. This was when Samuel should have noticed that no one in the bar was looking at him anymore. They were all looking past him. At the man who had risen from the booth in the far corner, the one shrouded in shadow where the neon lights didn't quite reach. The man who had been sitting there for the past 20 minutes, nursing a single whiskey that he'd barely touched, dressed entirely in black despite the bar's oppressive heat. Andrea Bellini moved forward with the kind of deliberate calm that separated predators from pretenders. He was taller than Samuel, broader through the shoulders, his close-cropped beard and shaved head giving him the appearance of someone who'd stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only function and purpose. Intricate tattoos crawled up his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, the kind of ink that told stories to people who knew how to read them. But it was his eyes that changed the room's temperature. Dark, calculating, patient in a way that suggested violence was a tool he'd mastered so completely that he no longer needed to rush toward it. He stopped 3 feet behind Samuel, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give the thug one chance to make a better choice. "Take your hand off my sister." The words weren't loud, weren't shouted, weren't even particularly threatening in their construction. But every person in that bar understood they were final. Samuel Roga felt the shift in pressure, the way prey animals sense a wolf before they see it. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the man in black standing behind him, and in that fractured second of recognition, Samuel's entire understanding of the situation began to collapse, because he knew that face, not personally, not directly. But he'd seen it in photographs passed around back rooms where serious men discussed territories and treaties, had heard the name spoken in whispers by people who genuinely understood what the word dangerous meant when applied to human beings. The knife trembled slightly against Elisa's throat. Andrea Bellini didn't move like men who needed to prove themselves. There was no hurried aggression, no theatrical posturing, no wasted energy telegraphing what came next. He simply existed in the space behind Samuel Roga, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already calculated every possible outcome and found them all acceptable. Samuel's hand wavered, the knife still pressed against Elisa's throat but losing the conviction that had animated it moments before. He tried to maintain his grip on her, tried to hold on to the dominance he'd established, but his fingers had begun to betray him, trembling in microscopic spasms that everyone could see. "I said," Andrea repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Take your hand off my sister." The bar had transcended silence into something deeper, a collective held breath, a suspended moment where violence hung in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Patrons who'd been frozen now began making microscopic adjustments, shifting weight onto back feet, calculating distances to exits, preparing for whatever came next. Andrea took 1 step forward, closing the distance to less than 2 feet. From this proximity, Samuel could smell expensive cologne mixed with something else, something metallic and ancient that his hindbrain recognized as danger. The man behind him radiated control the way furnaces radiate heat, constant, undeniable, transformative to everything around it. Samuel tried to salvage the situation with bravado. "You know who I work for. You know what happens if you—" "I know exactly who you work for," Andrea interrupted, his tone suggesting this information bored him. "I know your brother runs territory on the east side. I know you've been operating out of this bar for 7 months. I know you've put 3 people in the hospital and think that makes you dangerous." Each statement landed like a physical blow, not because of volume or threat, but because they demonstrated a level of awareness that Samuel hadn't anticipated. This wasn't a random confrontation. This was a man who'd been watching, cataloging, waiting. Andrea's eyes never left Samuel's profile, studying him the way entomologists study insects pinned to boards. "What you don't know," he continued, "is that I've been sitting in that booth for 23 minutes, watching you work up the courage to touch her, watching you convince yourself that no one would stop you, watching you make the choice that ends this for you." The words hung in the stale air, their meaning sinking through Samuel's alcohol-fogged consciousness like stones through water. This hadn't been intervention. It had been observation. Andrea Bellini had watched the entire escalation unfold, had allowed it to reach this precise moment, and that realization was somehow more terrifying than the immediate threat of violence, because it meant this was deliberate, calculated, personal. Samuel's grip on Elisa loosened fractionally, his body betraying his eroding confidence even as his mouth tried to maintain control. "Look, man," I didn't know she was. You knew exactly what she was, Andrea said, cutting through the excuse like it didn't exist. She told you to stop. She warned you who I was. You chose not to listen because you thought fear belonged to everyone except you. Andrea shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a movement so subtle most people missed it, but Samuel felt it like seismic activity, the ground beneath him becoming unstable. The man in black hadn't reached for a weapon, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything overtly threatening, yet Samuel could feel his options collapsing, closing in like walls in a shrinking room. Last chance, Andrea said, and these two words contained more finality than Samuel had heard in his entire life. Let her go, or I take the knife from you. Samuel's brain screamed at him to comply, to release Elisa and step back and apologize and pray this man showed mercy. But his pride, that toxic masculine pride that had gotten him through 24 bar fights and countless confrontations, wouldn't let him surrender completely. He needed to save something, needed to walk away from this with at least a shred of his reputation intact. His mistake was believing he had negotiating power. We're just gonna walk out of here, Samuel said, trying to inject authority back into his voice. Me and her, nice and slow, and nobody gets. Andrea moved. The motion was so economical, so perfectly efficient, that most of the bar didn't register it as movement until it had already concluded. His right hand came up, 2 fingers extended, and caught Samuel's wrist at a precise pressure point that medical students spend years learning to locate. Samuel's fingers spasmed involuntarily, muscles seizing from the focused nerve strike. The knife dropped, tumbling through the air in what seemed like slow motion, the blade catching neon light as it fell. Andrea's left hand moved simultaneously, catching the weapon before it completed its descent to the floor. The switchblade disappeared into his palm, was reversed, examined briefly, then pocketed in one fluid sequence that took perhaps 2 seconds, but demonstrated such absolute mastery of violence that several patrons audibly gasped. No punches thrown, no blood drawn, no raised voices or dramatic pronouncements. Just silence and the sound of Samuel's labored breathing as he clutched his nerveless wrist. Elisa stepped smoothly to the side, out of Samuel's reach, her composure never breaking, her expression unchanged. She moved to stand beside her brother, not behind him, a subtle positioning that spoke volumes about their relationship. She wasn't being protected so much as acknowledged, her presence beside Andrea a statement rather than a refuge. Andrea finally looked directly at Samuel, making full eye contact for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the bar's dim lighting, and they held the kind of emptiness that comes from having made permanent decisions about human life too many times to count. Do you know who I am? Andrea asked quietly. Samuel nodded, his throat too dry for words. Say my name. Samuel's voice cracked. Bellini, full name. Andrea Bellini. The bar remained frozen, every patron now understanding they were witnessing something that would be discussed in whispers for years. The name carried weight, history, implications that rippled through the criminal underworld like aftershocks from an earthquake. Andrea leaned in, close enough that only Samuel could hear what came next, and whispered something that drained the color from the thug's face completely. Then Andrea stepped back, pocketed the knife that had threatened his sister, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Run." Samuel didn't walk, didn't swagger, didn't attempt to salvage his reputation. He bolted for the exit like a man fleeing demons, his heavy boots pounding against the floor, the door crashing open to admit cold night air, and the sound of his panicked flight disappearing into darkness. Andrea turned to his sister, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. You okay? Elisa nodded once, her composure finally showing the smallest crack, not fear, but relief. I'm okay. The bar remained frozen for another 5 seconds after Samuel's exit, patrons locked in place like a photograph of shock and disbelief. Then, slowly, like ice thawing, people began to move again. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Glasses were lifted with trembling hands. The bartender finally noticed the whiskey still pouring from the bottle he'd forgotten he was holding. But everyone's attention remained on the man in black and the waitress who stood beside him, both of them impossibly calm in the aftermath of violence that had somehow occurred without a single drop of blood being spilled. Andrea Bellini surveyed the room with the clinical detachment of someone conducting an inventory. His gaze moved from face to face, cataloging witnesses, assessing threats, calculating whether anyone present required additional attention. What he found satisfied him, a room full of people who understood that what they'd witnessed was not their business, would never be their business, and should be forgotten as quickly as human memory would allow. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew Samuel's switchblade, examining it under the neon light with the focused attention of someone appraising a curiosity. The blade was cheap, probably purchased at a truck stop or pawn shop. The kind of weapon men bought because it looked dangerous, rather than because it was effective. The handle was scratched, the mechanism slightly loose. "He pressed this against your throat," Andrea said to Elisa, his voice carrying none of the coldness it had held moments before. Now it contained something else, controlled fury wrapped in concern, the kind of anger that burns cold rather than hot. "He did," Elisa confirmed, her own voice steady despite everything. "I warned him. I know you did." Andrea closed the blade with a decisive click, the sound sharp enough to make several nearby patrons flinch. "I heard every word." This revelation rippled through Elisa's composure, creating the first visible crack in her carefully maintained control. Her eyes widened slightly. "You heard? I've been here since you started your shift," Andrea said, returning the closed knife to his pocket. "Corner booth, watching." "Why didn't you?" Elisa started, then stopped herself, understanding flooding her expression. "You wanted to see what he'd do. I wanted to see what you'd do," Andrea corrected gently. "And you did exactly what I taught you. You stayed calm. You warned him clearly. You gave him every opportunity to make a better choice." He turned to face her fully now, his expression softening in ways the rest of the bar couldn't see, but that transformed his entire presence. To everyone else, he was still the predator who'd dismantled Samuel Roga without breaking a sweat. To his sister, he was something more complicated: protector, teacher, family. "But the moment he touched you," Andrea continued, his voice dropping lower, "the moment that blade touched your skin, it stopped being about choices. It became about consequences." Elisa nodded slowly, processing not just the words but the implications beneath them. She'd grown up adjacent to this world, had always known her brother's reputation, but she'd deliberately kept distance from the violence that defined his profession. She worked, she lived her life, she maintained boundaries that allowed her to pretend normalcy was possible. Tonight had shattered those boundaries. "He's going to tell his brother," Elisa said. Not a question, but a statement of inevitable fact. "Yes," Andrea agreed. "And his brother will come." "Yes. Because of me." Andrea's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Not because of you. Because of him. Because Samuel Roga put his hands on someone under my protection and thought there wouldn't be consequences. Because men like him only understand power, and power demands response." He gestured to the pocket where he'd stored the knife. "This isn't just a weapon anymore. It's a message. Samuel will run straight to his brother, probably already has, and he'll tell him everything. The knife, the name, the sister he didn't know I had. And his brother will understand that this isn't random. This is deliberate." Elisa absorbed this information, her analytical mind working through the implications the way someone might solve a complex equation. "You wanted them to know about me. I wanted them to understand that lines exist," Andrea corrected. "That some boundaries can't be crossed without retaliation. Samuel's been operating in this bar for months, terrorizing people, building a reputation on fear. Tonight, he learned that fear has hierarchies, and he's nowhere near the top." A patron at a nearby table shifted nervously, his chair scraping against the floor. Andrea's attention snapped to him instantly, his entire body language transforming back into predator alertness so quickly it was almost physically jarring to witness. The man froze mid-movement, recognizing his mistake. "Relax," Andrea said, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "Nobody here is in danger. What happened tonight was personal, specific, and concluded." He let his gaze sweep across the entire bar. "But what happened tonight also didn't happen. You all understand me?" Heads nodded in rapid agreement. The bartender, finding his voice, managed a strangled, "Yes, sir." "Good." Andrea returned his attention to Elisa. "We're leaving. Together. You don't come back to this bar. You don't work anywhere. Samuel Roga or his people can find you easily. Not because you're hiding, but because we're resetting the board." "My apartment," Elisa started, "already secured. I had people there before I came here." Andrea's expression suggested this wasn't up for debate. "You'll stay with me until this resolves. A few days, maybe a week." "You knew this would happen," Elisa said, accusation creeping into her voice for the first time. "You knew he'd escalate tonight." "I knew he'd try something eventually," Andrea admitted. "Men like Samuel always do. They mistake patience for weakness, silence for submission. They push until something pushes back harder. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture gentle despite the violence those same hands had just executed. "I'm sorry you had to feel that blade against your throat. I'm sorry I let it go that far. But you needed to understand what this world is, what it does to people, why I've kept you separate from it for so long." Elisa met her brother's eyes, seeing past the Mafia boss to the person who'd protected her since childhood, who'd built walls around her made of reputation and fear so she could live something resembling a normal life. "And now? Now they know you exist," Andrea said simply, "which means the rules change, for everyone." He guided her toward the exit, his body positioned between her and the rest of the bar, a human shield moving with practiced efficiency. At the door, he paused, looking back at the room one final time. "The knife stays with me," he announced to no one and everyone. "Anyone asks about tonight, you don't know anything. You weren't here. This place was empty." The bar murmured collective agreement. Andrea and Elisa stepped into the cold night air, leaving behind a room full of people who would indeed claim they'd seen nothing, remembered nothing, knew nothing about the night a waitress's quiet warning became a declaration of war. Samuel Roga's lungs burned as he sprinted through the industrial district, his boots slapping against wet pavement in rhythmic panic. The cold night air scraped his throat with each gasping breath, but he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, couldn't do anything except run from the memory of those dark eyes that had seen through him like he was made of glass. His wrist still throbbed where Andrea Bellini had struck it, the nerve damage sending electric pulses up his forearm. The knife was gone. His weapon, his symbol of power, his tool of intimidation pocketed by a man who'd taken it as casually as someone picking up dropped change. But worse than the physical pain, worse than the humiliation, was the knowledge burning in his chest like swallowed acid. He'd threatened Andrea Bellini's sister, a sister no one in the criminal underworld knew existed until tonight. A secret that had just been exposed because Samuel had been too arrogant, too stupid, too convinced of his own untouchability to recognize a warning when it was delivered in a calm, measured voice. He knew that name. Everyone who operated in the city's shadow economy knew that name. Andrea Bellini didn't run protection rackets or manage street-level dealers. He didn't waste time with bar fights or territorial pissing matches. He operated at a level where problems were resolved permanently, where people disappeared so completely their families stopped asking questions, where entire operations could be dismantled overnight without a single witness coming forward. Samuel had heard the stories always secondhand, always whispered, always treated with the kind of reverence people reserve for natural disasters. The warehouse fire that killed 7 members of the Kozlov family. The shipping container found empty except for dental records. The prosecutor who'd taken early retirement and left the country within 48 hours of announcing an investigation. And Samuel had just pressed a knife against that man's sister's throat. The realization made his stomach clench, threatening to empty itself onto the street. He slowed to a jog, then a walk, his body finally overriding his panic with exhaustion. He bent double, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath while his mind raced through impossible scenarios. Maybe he could leave town, tonight, right now. Just disappear and hope Andrea Bellini considered him too insignificant to pursue. But even as the thought formed, Samuel knew it was fantasy. Men like Andrea Bellini didn't let threats to their family walk away. They made examples. They sent messages that echoed through the underworld for years, unless Samuel straightened slowly, a different kind of fear replacing his panic. His older brother, Leo Roga, controlled substantial territory on the east side, commanded real soldiers, had connections and resources that could potentially stand against even someone like Bellini. Leo would know what to do. Leo always knew what to do. The decision made, Samuel oriented himself and began moving with renewed purpose toward his brother's headquarters, a converted auto shop that served as the nerve center for the Roga family's operations. His hand trembled as he pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over Leo's contact, then thought better of it. This conversation needed to happen face-to-face. Some news was too volatile to deliver over potentially monitored lines. The walk took 20 minutes, each step allowing his fear to metastasize into something else justification. By the time Samuel reached the auto shop's reinforced door, he'd constructed a narrative where he was the victim, where Andrea Bellini had overreacted, where the appropriate response was overwhelming retaliation. He pounded on the door, the sound echoing in the empty street. A slot opened, eyes assessed him, then the door swung inward. Samuel pushed past the guard, ignoring the surprised questions, and headed straight for the back office, where he knew his brother would be conducting late-night business. Leo Roga looked up from the desk as Samuel burst through the door, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern in the span of a heartbeat. Where Samuel was all visible rage and obvious violence, Leo possessed the calculated cruelty of someone who'd turned brutality into a business model. He was older by 6 years, broader through the shoulders, his face carrying scars from wars Samuel was too young to remember. What happened? Leo's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Samuel's carefully constructed narrative collapsed the moment he tried to speak. The words tumbled out in fragments: the bar, the waitress, the warning he'd ignored, the man in black who'd appeared like a ghost, the knife taken so easily it seemed like magic. "Slow down," Leo commanded, standing now, his full attention focused on his younger brother. "Start from the beginning. What waitress?" Samuel forced himself to breathe, to organize his thoughts. "There's this girl who works at the bar on 7th Street. I was establishing presence, showing people who runs things. She got mouthy, disrespectful. I had to teach her a lesson." "You put your hands on her," Leo said. Not a question. "I was making a point." "You put your hands on her," Leo repeated, his tone hardening. "And then what?" Someone interfered. A man. He was just sitting there, watching, and then Samuel's voice faltered, the memory making his wrist throb. "He took my knife. Just took it. Like I was nothing." Leo moved around the desk with predatory grace, studying his brother's face, reading the fear there. Who was he? This was the moment. The revelation that would change everything. Samuel met his brother's eyes and spoke the name that had been burning in his throat since he'd fled the bar. Andrea Bellini. The room went silent. Not the expectant silence of people waiting for more information, but the absolute silence of people processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of a situation. Leo's expression didn't change dramatically, his control was too refined for that, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration that Samuel recognized as danger. "Andrea Bellini," Leo repeated slowly. "You're certain?" He said his name, made me say it back to him. Samuel's voice cracked slightly. "He knew everything about us, about you, about our territory. Everything." "Why?" Leo asked, the question sharp as a blade. Why would Andrea Bellini care about some waitress in a nothing bar on 7th Street? Samuel swallowed hard. "She's his sister." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Leo stood completely still, his mind clearly racing through implications, connections, strategic calculations that existed several moves beyond Samuel's comprehension. "Andrea Bellini has a sister," Leo said finally, almost to himself. "All these years, all the intelligence, all the information we've gathered, and nobody knew he had a sister." "I didn't know," Samuel started. "Of course you didn't know." Leo's control finally cracked, voice rising with controlled fury. "Because she was a secret. She was protected. She was kept completely separate from his world. Until tonight. Until you put your goddamn hands on her and dragged her into visibility." Leo Roga turned away from his brother, hands gripping the edge of his desk hard enough that his knuckles went white. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of decisions that needed to be made in the next few minutes. Decisions that would determine whether the Roga family survived the week intact or became another cautionary tale whispered in back rooms. "Tell me exactly what he said," Leo demanded, his voice regaining its calculated coldness. "Word for word. Every detail matters." Samuel replayed the encounter, his memory sharp despite the panic that had clouded everything else. The nerve strike, the effortless disarmament, the clinical way Andrea had examined the knife before pocketing it. And finally, the whispered words that only Samuel had heard, the words that had sent him running into the night. He said. Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon their speaker. "He said he knew where I lived, knew my routines. Said he'd been watching me for weeks, waiting for me to cross a line that would justify response. Then he told me to run, to tell you who took my knife, and that he'd be waiting." The last part landed like a physical blow. Leo's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the scar tissue that ran from his left ear to his chin. "He wanted you to come here, wanted you to tell me." "I don't understand," Samuel said, confusion mixing with his fear. "If he wanted to send a message, why didn't he just—" "Because killing you would be simple," Leo interrupted. "Would be over in seconds and forgotten by morning. This?" He gestured at his brother's shaking hands, at the visible terror still etched in Samuel's features. "This is strategic." He lets you live knowing you've made a fatal mistake, lets you carry that fear back to me, lets me understand that he's aware of our organization, our capabilities, our history. He's not declaring war, he's reminding us one already exists. Samuel blinked, lost. What are you talking about? Leo moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain beneath his shirt, and withdrew a folder thick with photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. He dropped it on the desk with enough force to make Samuel jump. Andrea Bellini and I have history, Leo said, opening the folder to reveal surveillance photos of a younger Andrea, images that looked at least a decade old. Before you were running with us, before you thought you were dangerous, the Bellini and Roga families were at war over East Side territory. Not the petty fights you're used to, actual war, bombings, assassinations, entire crews eliminated overnight. He pulled out a specific photograph, sliding it across the desk. It showed a burned-out warehouse, bodies covered by tarps being loaded into coroners' vans. 17 months of escalation that ended when both families lost so many soldiers we couldn't sustain operations. A truce was negotiated, territories were clearly defined, and both sides agreed to pretend the other didn't exist unless those boundaries were violated. Samuel stared at the photographs, seeing his brother's world with new clarity. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know, Leo said harshly. That's the point of a truce. You let the past stay buried so the present can function. But truces have rules, Samuel. The most important being, you don't touch family, ever, under any circumstances. The implications crystallized in Samuel's mind with horrifying clarity. So, when I grabbed his sister, you violated the most sacred rule in our world, Leo finished. You gave Andrea Bellini justification to restart a war we barely survived the first time. Except now he's more experienced, more connected, more dangerous than he was a decade ago. And we're weaker, spread thinner, with younger soldiers who've never faced someone like him. 3 other men had entered the office during this exchange, drawn by Leo's raised voice. They stood in the doorway, their expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm as they processed the conversation. Bellini? One of them said. A scarred enforcer named Dmitri, who'd been with the Roga family since before the First War. His face had gone pale. Andrea Bellini? The same, Leo confirmed. Christ, Dmitri breathed. I thought we had an understanding with him. We did, Leo said. Until tonight. He turned back to Samuel, his expression hardening into something cold and evaluative, looking at his younger brother not with familial concern but with strategic assessment. Where's your knife? He kept it, Samuel admitted, the words tasting like ash. Pocketed it right in front of everyone. This detail made Dmitri curse in Russian. That's a declaration. He's keeping evidence, a trophy. He's telling us he's not hiding what happened, not concerned about retaliation, because he's prepared for it. Leo agreed. Probably has been since the moment Samuel put hands on his sister, which means we're already 3 moves behind in a game where being 1 move behind usually proves fatal. Another man stepped forward, younger, eager in the way soldiers are before they've seen real violence. So we hit him first. Hard. Show him we're not the same organization he fought before. And his sister? Leo asked, his voice dangerously quiet. What do we do about her? The young soldier's enthusiasm faltered. I mean, if she's involved. She's not involved, Leo cut him off sharply. She's a waitress. A civilian. Andrea kept her completely separate from his operations for years specifically so she wouldn't become a target. But now, thanks to my idiot brother, we know she exists, and Andrea knows we know. He let that information settle over the room like fallout, which means if we retaliate against him directly, he'll assume we're considering her a legitimate target. He'll move to protect her aggressively, eliminating any perceived threats before they materialize. And we'll all be dead before we understand what's happening. So what do we do? Dmitri asked, his professional calm masking obvious concern. Leo was silent for a long moment, his mind running through scenarios, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same bloody conclusion. The truce had kept both families operational for nearly a decade, had allowed territories to be profitable without the constant hemorrhaging of resources that war demanded. But pride was currency in their world. Reputation was armor. And his brother had been publicly humiliated, disarmed, sent running like a child who'd broken a window and feared his father's belt. We respond, Leo said finally. Not because we want war, but because not responding makes us look weak. Andrea Bellini will understand that he's counting on it. He let Samuel live specifically, so we'd be forced into this position. He's manipulating us into starting something, Dmitri observed. Yes, Leo agreed. But he's also giving us a chance to handle this within the rules. The knife Samuel lost is evidence of aggression against Bellini's family. If we acknowledge the violation, accept responsibility, and offer appropriate compensation, we might resolve this before it escalates beyond control. Samuel's face flushed with humiliation. You're going to apologize? Make me look like... I'm going to keep you alive, Leo interrupted coldly. And keep this family operational. Your pride is not worth another war with Andrea Bellini. He picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found one that hadn't been used in years. His thumb hovered over the call button. If I make this call, Leo said to the room, I'm admitting weakness. Admitting my brother crossed a line. But if I don't make this call, Andrea Bellini will interpret our silence as preparation for war, and he'll strike first. Andrea Bellini's phone vibrated against the mahogany desk in his private office, the screen illuminating with a number he hadn't seen active in nearly a decade. He stared at it for 3 full rings before answering, his expression unchanging, though Elisa, seated across from him in a leather chair that probably cost more than a month's wages, noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Leo, Andrea said by way of greeting, his voice neutral, giving nothing away. Elisa watched her brother's face, trying to read the conversation from his micro-expressions. She'd been in his penthouse for less than an hour, still processing the transition from her modest apartment to this fortress of wealth and control. The space was elegant but austere, expensive furniture arranged with geometric precision, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, security so sophisticated it was nearly invisible. I'm aware, Andrea said into the phone, his tone cooling by degrees. Your brother made his position very clear. A pause. Listening. Compensation, Andrea repeated, and something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. You think money resolves a knife against my sister's throat? Another pause, longer this time. I understand the optics, Andrea continued. I understand you're trying to de-escalate, and I appreciate the call, Leo. I do. It shows more wisdom than your brother demonstrated tonight. He leaned back in his chair, his free hand drumming a slow rhythm on the armrest. But here's what you need to understand. Samuel didn't just violate our truce. He exposed something I've kept hidden for 26 years. My sister's existence was the most carefully guarded secret in my life, and now it's currency in a world she never chose to be part of. Elisa felt something tighten in her chest at those words. 26 years, her entire life, Andrea had been constructing walls around her, keeping her separate, protected, anonymous, and one arrogant thug with a cheap knife had demolished those walls in minutes. No, Andrea said firmly into the phone. I don't accept your apology on Samuel's behalf. If he wants forgiveness, he asks himself. In person. On his knees. His voice dropped even lower. And Leo? If you're calling to negotiate because you're afraid of war, let me ease your mind. I don't want war either. War is expensive, messy, and attracts attention neither of us can afford. What I want is for Samuel to understand, truly understand the magnitude of his mistake. He listened for another moment, then, tomorrow, noon, the warehouse district, the old Riverside facility. You know the one. Bring Samuel. Bring whoever you need to feel secure, but come ready to listen, not to negotiate. Andrea ended the call without waiting for confirmation. Setting the phone down with deliberate care, he sat in silence for several seconds, his mind clearly processing multiple scenarios simultaneously, before finally looking at his sister. You heard, he said. Most of it. Elisa's voice was steadier than she felt. You're meeting with them. I'm establishing parameters, Andrea corrected. Leo Roga is smart enough to know this could spiral into something neither family survives. He's trying to contain his brother's stupidity before it becomes everyone's problem. And you? What are you trying to do? Andrea stood, moving to the windows overlooking the city's glittering sprawl. Lights stretched to the horizon, each one representing lives being lived, choices being made, consequences rippling outward in patterns too complex to fully predict. I'm protecting you, he said simply. Everything else is secondary. By starting a war? By preventing one. Andrea turned to face her, and for the first time that night, she saw past the Mafia boss to the older brother who'd raised her after their parents died, who'd attended her school plays while building a criminal empire, who'd somehow managed to keep her innocent of the blood that financed her education. Samuel violated you, Elisa. Put his hands on you. Threatened your life in front of witnesses. In our world, that demands response. If I do nothing, I look weak. Other families start wondering if the Bellini name has lost its weight, if boundaries can be crossed without consequence. He moved back to the desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew Samuel's knife, placing it between them like evidence in a trial. But if I respond with overwhelming violence, if I kill Samuel, dismantle the Roga operation, salt the earth where they operate, I start a war that draws law enforcement attention we can't afford. Other families get nervous, start making preemptive moves. The entire ecosystem destabilizes. So tomorrow I demonstrate restraint wrapped in threat, Andrea finished. I show Leo that I could destroy them, but I'm choosing not to, provided they understand the new rules. Samuel violated our truce, but he also gave me leverage. Now they know you exist, which means they know I have something to protect beyond reputation and territory. That makes me predictable in ways I wasn't before. Elisa processed this, her analytical mind working through the chess game her brother had been playing since the moment Samuel grabbed her wrist. You planned this. You let him escalate because you knew how it would play out. I anticipated possibilities, Andrea said carefully. I've been watching Samuel for months, ever since he started operating in that bar. He's sloppy, arrogant, the kind of street-level thug who thinks violence equals power. I knew eventually he'd push too far with someone, create an incident that would give me an opening. An opening for what? Andrea was silent for a moment, choosing his words with obvious care. The truce with the Roga family has held for a decade because both sides respected the boundaries, but Leo's been expanding lately, testing edges, moving into territories that aren't explicitly forbidden but aren't explicitly permitted either. I've let it slide because maintaining peace was worth more than marginal territory gains. He picked up the knife, examining it in the dim light. But Samuel's action changes the calculus. Now I can renegotiate from a position of moral authority. The Roga family violated our truce by threatening my family. That gives me leverage to push back on Leo's territorial creep, to re-establish boundaries that have become blurred, all while appearing reasonable because I'm not retaliating with violence. You're using what happened to me, Elisa said slowly, as a strategic opportunity. I'm using what Samuel did to you, Andrea corrected, his voice hardening. I didn't put that knife to your throat. I didn't create this situation. But now that it exists, I'm ensuring it serves a purpose beyond trauma. Elisa stood, moving to stand beside her brother at the window. Below them, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the negotiations happening in penthouses and converted auto shops. Deals being struck that would determine who controlled which streets, which businesses paid protection to whom, which families prospered and which disappeared. What happens if they don't accept your terms tomorrow? She asked. Andrea's reflection in the window showed an expression Elisa had never seen before. Not anger, not threat, but absolute certainty. Then I dismantle the Roga family so completely that 10 years from now, people will struggle to remember they ever existed. You can do that? I've done it before. The simplicity of that statement, delivered without bravado or hesitation, sent a chill through Elisa. This was her brother, the man who'd taught her to ride a bicycle, who'd scared away her high school boyfriend with nothing but a conversation, who'd quietly paid her university tuition while she believed she'd earned a full scholarship. This was also Andrea Bellini, a name that made hardened criminals reconsider their choices, a man who'd built an empire on the foundation of consequences delivered with surgical precision. I don't want people to die because of me, Elisa said quietly. Andrea placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture gentle despite everything. No one dies because of you. If anyone dies, it's because Samuel Roga made a choice, and Leo Roga failed to control him. You're not responsible for other people's stupidity, but I'm the reason. You're the reason I'm being careful, Andrea interrupted. You're the reason I'm negotiating instead of eliminating. You're the reason there's still a chance this ends without bodies. He squeezed her shoulder gently. In this world, Elisa, mercy is rare. The fact that I'm offering it at all is because of you. His phone buzzed again, not a call this time, but a series of messages. Andrea glanced at the screen, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. What? Elisa asked. Leo's moving people into position around the Riverside facility, Andrea said, his tone neutral but his body language shifting into something more alert. Setting up his security for tomorrow's meeting. Isn't that expected? It is. Andrea set the phone down. But he's using more men than necessary for a negotiation. which means either he's genuinely afraid of what I might do, or he's preparing for possibilities beyond tomorrow's conversation. You think he'll try something? I think, Andrea said carefully, that Leo Roga is a survivor who's built his organization by being paranoid and prepared. He'll come to tomorrow's meeting ready to talk, but also ready for betrayal, which is exactly what I'd do in his position. He turned away from the window, his demeanor shifting back into the calculated control that defined him. Which is why I'm already 3 moves ahead. The Riverside facility had been abandoned for 6 years, a skeletal monument to failed industrial ambitions on the city's eastern edge. Rusted corrugated metal, broken windows like missing teeth, concrete floors stained with decades of oil and chemical residue. It was the kind of place where serious conversations happened, because no one passing by would think twice about cars parked in the gravel lot or men disappearing through steel doors. Leo Roga arrived 15 minutes early with 6 soldiers, more than he'd initially planned but less than Dmitri had recommended. They swept the building methodically, checking corners, testing sightlines, identifying exits that might conceal ambushes. The space was vast and empty, their footsteps echoing off metal walls, sunlight streaming through gaps in the roof to create bars of illumination in the dusty air. "Clear," Dmitri reported, his voice tight with tension. "No one's here yet." "Position everyone," Leo ordered. "Sight lines on all entrances. If Bellini brings an army, I want to know before they're inside." Samuel stood near the center of the space, looking small despite his size. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. He'd barely slept, kept replaying the moment Andrea Bellini had taken his knife, had spoken his name with such casual finality. His wrist still throbbed, a constant reminder of how easily he'd been dismantled. "When he arrives," Leo said, moving to stand beside his brother, "you apologize, clearly, specifically, without excuses. You acknowledge you violated boundaries, threatened his sister, acted without authority or wisdom. You ask for mercy. Understand." Samuel's jaw clenched, pride warring with survival instinct. "I understand." "I'm serious, Samuel. Your ego nearly started a war. The only reason you're still breathing is because Bellini chose to let you live. That's not weakness, that's strategy. He's giving us a chance to resolve this within the rules. If you fuck this up with posturing or excuses, I'll let him have you." The words landed like a slap. Samuel had never heard that tone from his brother, that cold willingness to sacrifice family for organizational survival. It clarified their relationship in ways that would have devastated him if he weren't already drowning in fear. The sound of a vehicle approaching made everyone tense. Dmitri signaled from his position near the main entrance, holding up 3 fingers, 3 vehicles. Leo's expression didn't change, but Samuel saw his brother's hand drift toward the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. Could be overkill. Could be message. Stay calm. The vehicles stopped outside, engines cutting simultaneously. Car doors opened and closed with mechanical precision. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with the coordinated rhythm of trained soldiers. Then the main door swung open, flooding the space with noon sunlight that temporarily blinded everyone inside. When Samuel's vision cleared, he stopped breathing. Andrea Bellini stood in the doorway, backlit by sunlight that created a silhouette more symbol than man. He was dressed entirely in black, tailored suit, dark shirt, no tie, his presence somehow filling the vast warehouse despite being one person among many. Tattoos visible at his neck and hands marked him as clearly as a signature, and his eyes, adjusting to the interior darkness, swept across the space with the practiced assessment of someone who'd walked into potential ambushes enough times to make it routine. But what made Samuel's blood freeze was who stood beside him. Elisa Bellini, dressed simply in dark jeans and a black jacket, her composure absolute, her presence transforming this from a negotiation between criminals into something far more personal. She wasn't hiding behind her brother or cowering in some safe house. She was here, present, forcing Samuel to confront exactly who he'd threatened. Andrea entered slowly, his movement deliberate, giving Leo's positioned soldiers time to register his arrival without panicking into violence. 2 men followed him inside, both large, both professional, both radiating the kind of competence that came from years of controlled brutality. But they stayed near the entrance, making no aggressive moves, establishing themselves as presence rather than threat. "Leo," Andrea said, his voice carrying clearly across the empty space. "Andrea," Leo responded, stepping forward carefully. "Thank you for coming. I don't recall having a choice." Andrea's tone remained neutral, but the words carried implication. When family is threatened, attendance becomes mandatory. He moved deeper into the warehouse, Elisa keeping pace beside him, until they stood 20 feet from where Leo and Samuel waited. Close enough for conversation, far enough that any sudden movement would be obvious before it became dangerous. Andrea's gaze fixed on Samuel, with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. No anger in his expression, no visible fury, just clinical evaluation that somehow felt worse than rage would have been. "You wanted this meeting," Andrea said to Leo, though his eyes never left Samuel. "Make it worth my time." Leo gestured toward his brother. "Samuel has something to say." The warehouse went silent except for wind whistling through gaps in the walls, a hollow sound that emphasized how alone Samuel suddenly felt despite being surrounded by allies. Every eye in the building focused on him, waiting for words that could determine whether this ended with handshakes or body bags. Samuel's throat felt like sandpaper. He forced himself to look at Andrea Bellini directly, then at Elisa, seeing in her steady gaze not fear but something more complex, recognition of the position he'd put himself in, understanding of what came next. Samuel started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I apologize. For what I did, for threatening your sister, for crossing lines I didn't understand existed." The words felt inadequate, hollow, but Andrea's expression didn't change. He simply waited, as if Samuel had said nothing at all. "I was drunk," Samuel continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "I was stupid. I didn't know who she was, didn't know who you—" "Stop," Andrea interrupted quietly. "You're apologizing for ignorance, not action. Try again." Samuel felt his face flush, humiliation, mixing with fear. He glanced at Leo, who gave the smallest nod. "Continue." It said, "Fix this." "I'm sorry I put my hands on her," Samuel said, focusing now on the specific violations. "I'm sorry I threatened her life. I'm sorry I made her feel unsafe in a place she worked. I'm sorry I violated your family's peace. And I'm sorry I disrespected the truce between our organizations." Andrea listened, without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Samuel finished, silence stretched for 5 full seconds that felt like hours. "Better," Andrea said finally. "More specific, but still incomplete. I don't understand." "You're sorry you violated boundaries," Andrea interrupted. "You're sorry you created problems. But are you sorry she felt a blade against her throat? Are you sorry she had to stand there wondering if she'd die because some drunk thug decided his ego was more important than her life?" The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Samuel found himself looking at Elisa again, really seeing her for the first time, not as an object to be dominated or a tool for establishing dominance, but as a person whose world had been violently disrupted by his choices. "Yes," Samuel said quietly, and for the first time, he meant it. "I'm sorry for that most of all." Andrea turned slightly, looking at his sister. "Elisa?" She studied Samuel for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she spoke, her voice calm and clear. "I accept your apology, but acceptance doesn't mean forgiveness. That requires time, if it comes at all." Andrea nodded once, then returned his attention to Leo. "Your brother apologized. That's step 1. Now we discuss what happens next. We're prepared to offer compensation," Leo started. "I don't want your money," Andrea cut him off. "I want assurances, boundaries, guarantees that this never happens again." He pulled Samuel's knife from his pocket, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the roof. "This stays with me. A reminder. And Samuel stays away from my sister permanently. If he's in a building and she enters, he leaves. If she's walking on a street, he crosses to the other side. She becomes invisible to him. Permanently." "Agreed," Leo said immediately. "Not finished," Andrea continued. "Your recent territorial expansions, the warehouses on 5th, the shipping routes through the harbor district, the protection rackets in the university quarter, all of it stops. You return to the boundaries established in our original truce." Leo's expression hardened slightly. "That's asking for a lot." "Your brother threatened my sister's life," Andrea said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "I'm asking for territory. That's mercy, Leo. Don't confuse it for weakness." Leo Roga's jaw tightened, the scar along his face stretching white against tanned skin. Around him, his soldiers shifted weight, hands drifting toward concealed weapons in unconscious response to their leader's tension. The warehouse air grew thicker, charged with the potential for violence that could erupt from a single wrong word. "Those territories were never explicitly yours," Leo said carefully, his voice controlled but strained. We moved into vacuum spaces, areas no one was actively controlling. Areas I left deliberately empty, Andrea corrected, his tone unchanging. Because maintaining peace was worth more than marginal profit. But your brother changed the equation. He violated the most fundamental rule: family remains untouchable. That violation reopens every negotiation, every boundary, every understanding we've maintained. He took 3 steps forward, closing the distance until he stood directly in front of Leo, close enough that their conversation became intimate despite the audience surrounding them. I could have killed Samuel last night. Could have made it look like an accident, a random mugging, a deal gone wrong. No one would have questioned it because that's how our world operates. But I didn't. I sent him back to you alive, carrying a message that I'm willing to resolve this within the structure that's kept both our families operational. Andrea held up the knife again, letting it catch the light. This is evidence of assault. In our world, that's a death warrant I'm choosing not to execute. So when I ask you to return to original boundaries, I'm not asking for concessions. I'm asking for acknowledgement that you understand the mercy being extended. Dmitri stepped forward slightly, his professional instinct recognizing a deal being offered that was better than alternatives. The territories Andrea mentioned represent maybe 15% of our current operations. Not insignificant, but survivable. Leo shot his second-in-command a sharp look, but Dmitri held his ground. I was there during the First War, Dmitri continued quietly. I remember what it cost, what we lost. If Andrea wanted those territories badly enough to fight for them, we'd already be fighting. This is negotiation, boss. Take it. The warehouse held its breath. Samuel stood frozen, understanding for the first time the larger game being played around his singular act of violence. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about power structures, territorial control, respect maintained through calculated restraint. Leo looked at Andrea, reading something in those dark, impassive eyes that Samuel couldn't interpret. A shared history, perhaps. A mutual understanding of how easily this could spiral into something neither man wanted, but both would prosecute with absolute brutality if forced. The territories returned to neutral status, Leo said finally. We pull back to pre-expansion boundaries, but the harbor district that stays in negotiation. It was genuinely unclaimed when we moved in, and pulling out completely would cost us relationships with suppliers who depend on our presence there. Andrea considered this for 3 full seconds, his face betraying nothing. Then, harbor district splits. You maintain the northern docks, I take the southern access points. Neither of us interferes with the other's operations in our respective zones. We establish a neutral meeting point for resolving disputes without escalation. Acceptable, Leo agreed. And Samuel's restriction remains absolute, Andrea added, his gaze shifting back to the younger Roga brother. He doesn't approach my sister, doesn't speak to her, doesn't occupy the same spaces. If circumstances force proximity, he removes himself immediately. This isn't negotiable. Understood, Leo confirmed. Andrea finally lowered the knife, sliding it back into his pocket with deliberate finality. Then we have an agreement. The territories revert within 72 hours. You document the transition, I verify compliance. The harbor district split takes effect immediately. I'll have maps drawn and delivered by end of business today, and Samuel's restriction becomes permanent policy within your organization. He turned to face Samuel directly, and despite the relatively neutral terms being discussed, his expression carried absolute warning. You made a mistake last night, a catastrophic one that should have ended with you bleeding out in an alley. The only reason you're breathing right now is because your brother values organizational stability over familial pride, and I value avoiding unnecessary wars. Andrea stepped closer, close enough that Samuel could smell expensive cologne and something underneath gun oil, maybe, or just the scent of controlled danger. But if you ever come near my sister again, if you speak her name, if you so much as think about what happened last night in ways that aren't soaked in regret, I will revisit my decision to let you live. And the second time, Leo won't be able to negotiate your survival. Are we clear? Samuel's mouth was desert dry, his voice barely functional. Yes, say it properly. We're clear, Samuel managed, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite every instinct screaming to look away. I understand. I'll never approach your sister again. Andrea studied him for another moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied. He turned back to Leo, his demeanor shifting from personal threat back to professional negotiation. Your men can stand down. This conversation is concluded. Leo gestured, and his soldiers relaxed fractionally, hands moving away from weapons. The warehouse's atmosphere began to decompress, tension bleeding out in visible stages as both groups recognized that violence had been averted through words rather than bloodshed. "I appreciate your restraint," Leo said, and the words carried genuine weight. "This could have gone very differently." "It still can," Andrea replied, but without heat. "This agreement holds as long as both sides honor it. The moment someone decides boundaries don't matter, we return to the conversation with different vocabulary." He moved toward Elisa, positioning himself slightly in front of her in a gesture so subtle most people wouldn't notice. But Samuel saw it clearly. Protection made muscle memory, a brother's instinct functioning beneath conscious thought. "One more thing," Andrea said, pausing at the threshold. "Samuel's knife stays with me permanently, not as trophy, but as reminder. Every time I look at it, I remember the restraint I showed tonight. And every time you see me, you remember why that restraint was strategic, rather than weakness." Leo nodded, understanding. "The knife is yours." Andrea and Elisa turned to leave, their two soldiers falling into formation behind them. They moved with coordinated precision, a unit that had clearly worked together through situations far more dangerous than this negotiation. As they reached the door, sunlight framing them in harsh silhouette, Elisa paused and looked back. Her gaze found Samuel across the warehouse's expanse. And for just a moment, they locked eyes, the woman who'd been threatened and the man who'd threatened her, separated now by agreements and boundaries that would define the rest of Samuel's life. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her expression communicated everything: acknowledgement of his apology, recognition of his fear, and absolute certainty that if he ever forgot this moment, the consequences would be permanent. Then she turned and walked into the sunlight, her brother beside her, leaving behind a warehouse full of men who understood they'd just witnessed something rare in their violent world. Conflict resolved through words, backed by credible threat of overwhelming force. But force that remained sheathed, because both sides valued survival over pride. The door closed behind them. The drive back to Andrea's penthouse happened in silence, the kind of quiet that follows tension rather than preceding it. Elisa sat in the passenger seat of the armored sedan, watching the city slide past through tinted windows, processing the encounter in the warehouse through the lens of someone who'd just seen behind the curtain of her brother's world. Andrea drove with the same measured precision he applied to everything, his hands steady on the wheel, his attention divided between traffic and the rearview mirror where he monitored the security vehicle following at a discreet distance. "You didn't have to bring me," Elisa said finally, breaking the silence as they merged onto the highway. "To the warehouse. That was about sending a message, not about my safety." "It was about both," Andrea replied, his eyes still scanning traffic patterns, looking for vehicles that maintained position too consistently, routes that suggested surveillance rather than coincidence. "Leo needed to see you not as an abstract concept or a strategic weakness, but as a person, someone real. It makes future violations harder to justify, harder to rationalize as just business. You used me as a prop." "I used you as a reminder of what's at stake," Andrea corrected gently. "There's a difference. In negotiations like that, Leo's calculating costs versus benefits, weighing whether retaliation is worth potential losses. But when you were standing there, the equation changed. It wasn't just about territory or pride anymore, it was about real consequences to a real person. That makes men think differently." Elisa turned to look at her brother's profile, seeing the tension still carried in his shoulders despite the successful negotiation. "You were prepared to kill them all. If it went wrong, you had a plan." It wasn't a question, but Andrea answered anyway. "Yes. The two men who came with us weren't just security, they were designated shooters positioned to eliminate everyone in that warehouse within seconds if the situation deteriorated. The vehicles outside weren't just transportation, they were mobile armories. And the building itself had been surveyed, mapped, contingency plans developed for every possible scenario." He glanced at her briefly before returning attention to the road. "But that's always the case, Elisa. Every meeting, every negotiation, every moment, I step outside the protection of my own territory. I'm prepared for betrayal. It's not paranoia, it's professional requirement. The moment you stop preparing for violence is the moment it finds you unprepared." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Andrea admitted. "But exhaustion is survivable. Complacency isn't." They exited the highway, navigating surface streets toward the upscale district where Andrea maintained his residence. The architecture changed around them, becoming cleaner, more modern, the kind of neighborhood where wealth insulated residents from the violence conducted on their behalf in less pristine areas. The territories he gave up, Elisa said, working through the strategic elements she'd witnessed. You didn't actually care about those, did you? Andrea smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she'd seen since they left the warehouse. I cared about establishing that boundaries can be renegotiated when violated. The specific territories were less important than the principal actions have consequences, and those consequences can be measured in tangible losses. So you asked for more than you wanted. I asked for enough that making concessions would feel like Leo won something. In reality, the territories I reclaimed were areas I'd planned to move back into anyway. He saved me the trouble of engineered conflicts by agreeing to withdraw voluntarily. Elisa shook her head, equal parts impressed and disturbed. You manipulated the entire situation. From the moment Samuel grabbed me, you were already planning how to turn it to strategic advantage. Not manipulated, Andrea objected. Anticipated. There's a difference. I didn't make Samuel threaten you. He did that based on his own arrogance and stupidity. What I did was recognize the opportunity his action created and position myself to benefit from the inevitable consequences. That's not manipulation, that's adaptation. They pulled into the underground parking garage of Andrea's building, the heavy security gate rolling closed behind them with mechanical finality. The space was pristine, well lit, monitored by cameras positioned to eliminate blind spots. Their security vehicle parked nearby, the two soldiers remaining vigilant even in this controlled environment. Andrea killed the engine but didn't immediately exit, his hand still resting on the steering wheel. I need to know you understand what happened today. Not just tactically, but personally. Elisa waited, sensing this was important. Samuel Roga will never forget the fear he felt in that bar, the humiliation of having his weapon taken, the knowledge that he survived only because I chose mercy over justice. That fear will define his relationship with our family for years, possibly forever. He'll tell that story to other people, and our reputation grows stronger without additional violence required. Andrea finally turned to face her fully. But Leo Roga is different. He's smart, professional, dangerous in ways Samuel will never be. Today, he negotiated in good faith because the cost-benefit analysis supported cooperation over conflict. But if circumstances change, if he perceives weakness, if opportunities present themselves, he'll recalculate. And when he does, you become relevant again. Not as a person, but as strategic leverage. The words settled heavy between them. You're saying I'm still in danger. I'm saying you're now visible in a world where visibility is vulnerability, Andrea clarified. Before last night you were unknown, protected by anonymity. Now, you're known to the Roga family, which means you're potentially known to others. Information travels in our circles despite best efforts at containment. He reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture of comfort he'd offered countless times throughout her life, but now weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand, which means things change. You don't go back to that bar. You don't maintain patterns that make you predictable. You accept security that you'll find intrusive and frustrating but necessary. You're asking me to live like you do, always watching, always preparing for violence. I'm asking you to recognize that proximity to me comes with costs, Andrea said quietly. Costs I've tried to shield you from your entire life, but costs that became unavoidable the moment Samuel put that knife to your throat. I'm sorry, truly. If I could undo his knowledge of your existence, I would, but I can't. So instead, I adapt. We adapt. Elisa absorbed this, feeling the walls of her previous life closing, being replaced by something more restricted, more complicated, defined by threats she'd only intellectually understood before. And if I don't want this? If I want to go back to normal? Andrea's expression showed genuine pain, not the cold calculation of the Mafia boss, but the concern of an older brother watching his sister lose something irreplaceable. Then I respect that decision. I'll provide what protection I can from a distance, but I won't force you into my world. It's your choice, Elisa. It's always been your choice. But choosing normal means choosing risk. Yes, Andrea admitted. Calculated risk that I'd minimize as much as possible, but risk nonetheless. Because Samuel knows who you are now. And people talk. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of changed circumstances pressing down on both of them. Finally, Elisa spoke. I need time, to think, to process, to decide what version of life I can actually live with. Take all the time you need, Andrea said, squeezing her shoulder gently before releasing her. But take it from here, from safety, where thinking happens without looking over your shoulder. They exited the vehicle, and Andrea's professionalism reasserted itself, immediately scanning the garage, noting the positions of security cameras, maintaining awareness of their escort's movements. The elevator ride to his penthouse happened in renewed silence, but this quiet felt different, less tense, more contemplative. As the elevator doors opened to reveal the sophisticated security of Andrea's private floor, Elisa paused at the threshold. "Thank you. For handling it the way you did. For not becoming the monster everyone thinks I am," Andrea finished with a slight smile. "I've always been strategic about when to be monstrous, Elisa. Today wasn't that day, though it could have been, easily, if the variables had aligned differently." He ushered her inside, and as the heavy door sealed behind them, Elisa felt simultaneously protected and trapped secure within her brother's fortress, but aware that fortresses exist because threats remain outside, waiting, patient, calculating their own strategies in response to today's negotiations. Samuel Roga hadn't slept properly in 4 nights. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt phantom pressure against his wrist where Andrea Bellini had struck with surgical precision, heard that quiet voice commanding him to run, saw those dark eyes that had evaluated him and found him fundamentally lacking. The knife was gone. His reputation was shattered. And worse than both, he was afraid. Real fear. The kind that lived in his chest like a parasite, that made him check over his shoulder in his own territory, that transformed every unexpected sound into potential threat. This wasn't the performative concern that came with dangerous work. This was primal recognition that he'd touched something far more dangerous than himself, and survived only through mercy he didn't deserve. Leo had been clear about expectations. Samuel was demoted effectively, removed from street operations, given administrative tasks that kept him away from situations requiring judgment or authority. The message was unspoken but absolute. "You're a liability now, and liabilities get contained until they prove otherwise." The other soldiers watched him differently too. Not with respect earned through violence, but with the cautious distance people maintain around broken things, objects that might still serve some function, but are no longer trusted for critical work. He sat now in the converted auto shop that served as family headquarters, filing paperwork related to the territorial concessions Leo had agreed to, documenting the withdrawal from areas that had represented months of careful expansion. Each address he recorded felt like a personal failure, territory lost because he'd been too stupid, too arrogant, too convinced of his own untouchability. Dmitri entered without knocking, dropping a sealed envelope on Samuel's desk. From Bellini. Samuel stared at the envelope like it might contain something toxic. "What is it?" "Maps. Harbor District divisions. Marked clearly so there's no confusion about boundaries." Dimitri's expression carried neither sympathy nor contempt, just professional assessment of someone who'd proven unreliable. "Study them. Memorize them, because if you accidentally cross into Bellini territory now, I can't protect you. Leo can't protect you. You'll have made a choice that voids every agreement negotiated to keep you breathing." "I understand," Samuel said quietly. Dmitri lingered at the doorway, his scarred face thoughtful. "You know what you actually did, Samuel? In that bar?" Samuel looked up, genuinely uncertain what answer was expected. "You gave Andrea Bellini exactly what he needed, justification, to renegotiate our entire relationship from a position of moral authority. He'd been watching our expansion for months, calculating when and how to push back. Then you handed him the perfect excuse wrapped in your ego and a cheap knife." The observation landed like a physical blow. Samuel had been so focused on his personal fear, his individual consequences, that he hadn't fully considered how his actions had served as catalyst for larger strategic shifts. "He played us," Dmitri continued. "Not through deception, but through patience. He let you escalate, let you cross lines, then used your violation to reset boundaries that had been slowly eroding in our favor. And the brilliant part? We can't even complain about it, because by every rule that governs our world, he showed restraint when he could have shown brutality." "I didn't mean to." "Intent is irrelevant," Dmitri interrupted. "Results are what matter. And the result is we're smaller, weaker, and now everyone knows that threatening Bellini's sister is a line that brings consequences. Which means his sister is more protected now than when she was anonymous. You didn't just fail to intimidate her, you made her safer by revealing she exists under his protection." Dmitri turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The knife you lost? Bellini has it mounted in his office apparently. Not hidden away, but displayed. Visitors see it. They ask about it, and he tells them exactly what it represents, a reminder of restraint, and the cost of forcing his hand. "He's using it to threaten people," Samuel said. "He's using it to remind people, including himself, that control has more power than rage, that mercy is a choice, not a weakness, and that some men are dangerous specifically because they know when not to be." Dimitri's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Learn from this, Samuel. Use the fear you're feeling as education, because the alternative is spending the rest of your very short life making the same mistakes until one of them becomes permanent." After Dimitri left, Samuel opened the envelope, spreading maps across his desk that clearly delineated territories now forbidden to him. Red lines drawn with precision, measurements exact, boundaries that represented invisible walls he could no longer cross without inviting consequences his imagination couldn't fully process. He thought about Elisa Bellini, wondered if she'd returned to normal life or remained in hiding, protected by her brother's reputation and resources, wondered if she thought about him at all, or if he'd already become irrelevant, just another violent man who'd learned too late that violence has hierarchies. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number containing a single line: "Boundaries exist for reasons. Remember them." No signature, no threat, just a reminder that someone was watching, someone remembered, someone remained patient and alert for any indication that lessons learned might be forgotten. Samuel deleted the message, but the words remained burned into his consciousness. This was his life now, defined by fear that had replaced bravado, by restrictions that had replaced freedom, by awareness that had replaced ignorance. He'd wanted respect, had believed violence was the currency that purchased it. Instead, he'd learned that true respect came from recognition of when to stop, when to retreat, when to acknowledge that some people occupied spaces on the food chain where arrogance became suicidal rather than strategic. The knife was gone. His reputation was shattered. His freedom was constrained. But he was alive. And in the world Andrea Bellini inhabited, the world Samuel had foolishly tried to claim space within, being alive was itself a form of mercy that some men spent years understanding they'd received. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, oblivious to negotiations conducted in warehouses, to boundaries redrawn in offices, to lessons taught in bars through violence avoided rather than violence delivered. Samuel Roga would never forget the feeling of that knife being taken from his hand, the sound of his name spoken by a man who'd already decided he wasn't worth killing. Some men learned from fear, some men were consumed by it. Samuel was still discovering which category would define the rest of his life, however long Andrea Bellini decided that life should be. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.